I'm Rahul Kanwal and you're watching the Newstrack. Kandahar has fallen. Could Kabul be next? And if the Taliban does take over the Afghan capital, what are the consequences for India and the rest of the world? That's my top focus on the Newstrack tonight. Taliban's sweep across Afghanistan continues as they took 4 more provincial capitals in a lightning offensive. At least 18 of the 34 provincial capitals have so far fallen, the biggest among them being Kandahar and Herat. The Pakistan-backed terrorists are now encircling Kabul. Some reports are saying that Taliban at this moment are just 80 kilometers from the Afghan capital. The Taliban now control more than 2/3 of the country just weeks after the United States withdrew its last troops.
Taliban terrorists on an armored vehicle driving through the Shahideen Square in Kandahar. The capture of Kandahar and Herat, the country's second and third largest cities, represent Taliban's 2 biggest military victories since they began their offensive in May. The deadly insurgency is fast turning into a rout of the Afghan National Army. Kandahar is particularly a heavy blow to the Afghan government. This is the heartland of the Taliban ethnic Pashtun fighters who emerged in the province in 1994 amidst the chaos of civil war. Of Afghanistan's major cities, the government still holds Mazar-e-Sharif in the north and Jalalabad near the Pakistani border in the east, and of course, capital Kabul. Taliban are now in full control of 14 of 34 provincial capitals after the collapse of Lashkar Gah, the capital of the Helmand province. The US intelligence assessment is that Taliban could try and isolate Kabul in the next 30 days and possibly take it over in under 90. Displaced people of Afghanistan have set up camps in parks in Kabul. The gateway to the capital has been choked with people fleeing violence elsewhere in the country. So desperate is the situation that late Thursday, the United States announced sending 3,000 frontline infantry soldiers back into Afghanistan to help evacuate the US embassy in Kabul. 3 infantry battalions are being redeployed in Afghanistan as of now.
So are you concerned they're going to be under attack?
As in all cases, our commanders will have the right of self-defense, and any attack upon our forces will be met with a swift and appropriate response.
The United Kingdom too has announced they will send in 600 soldiers to help evacuate British personnel, diplomats and staff from their mission in Afghanistan. The speed of the Taliban advance has sparked widespread anger over US President Joe Biden's decision to withdraw troops and leave Afghanistan to fight it out alone. Bureau Report, India Today.
The biggest question at this moment is why are the Afghan armed forces collapsing without putting up a tougher resistance? And if the Taliban at this moment are at the doors of Kabul, how soon could it be before the Afghan capital comes under Taliban's grip? Joining me on this broadcast, I want to welcome first, live from Mazar-e-Sharif in Afghanistan, Khalid Noor. Khalid Noor is the youngest member of the Afghan peace negotiating team. He's the son of one of the most prominent politicians of Afghanistan, Atta Muhammad Noor. He's also someone who's been called upon now to help with the armed resistance against the Taliban. The government now reaching out to former warlords, people with strength in the ground, asking them to join this battle. With us also on this broadcast is Gautam Mukhopadhyay. He's been India's former ambassador to Afghanistan. from 2010 to 2013. Before that, he actually went back to Kabul in November 2001 as the charge d'affaires after the ouster of the Taliban in Afghanistan. So he's seen this country very closely. Lieutenant General Syed Ata Hasnain has been writing on the military dimension of the conflict in Afghanistan. He's been a former general officer commanding of 15 Corps. He served in Sri Lanka, the Siachen Glacier, Northeast, Jammu and Kashmir, all across. With us on this broadcast, also live from Islamabad this time, is a man who Indian viewers would recall well, Abdul Basit. He's been the former High Commissioner of Pakistan to India from 2014 to 2017. Before that, he was Pakistan's envoy to Germany, a well-known, well-regarded Pakistani foreign affairs officer. Michael Kugelman joins us from Washington. He's the Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. He writes on Pakistan, India, Afghanistan and their relations with the United States. I want to go across first to Khalid Noor. If you could explain to our viewers who are watching with disbelief the fall of the Afghan forces, at the speed at which this is taking place. What's happening around Mazar-e-Sharif, where your family has a very strong bastion? What's happening in the ground? And what are the reports that you're picking up from other parts of the country? And what's your sense of why the Afghan armed forces aren't being able to put up a tougher fight?
Thank you very much for inviting me to the panel. I have to say that it is very unfortunate that we are experiencing these difficult days. Afghanistan is experiencing a humanitarian crisis right now. Slaughtering of our people by the Taliban across Afghanistan, unfortunately, is something that the entire international community is witnessing. Why and how did we come here? Of course, the irresponsible withdrawal of the United States troops and NATO did play a huge role in this. It damaged the morale of our soldiers, as well. It created a vacuum and for our Air Force they have technical problem and they cannot cover the entire country all at once. So this affected the entire armed forces of Afghanistan. Here in Mazar, we are prepared, our forces alongside national defense forces are prepared to defend the city, and we are not going to abandon our people, no matter the consequences, and we will keep resistance as long as it takes. It is going to be very difficult for the Taliban to take over Mazar-e-Sharif. The morale of our soldiers are very high, and we will fight and defend the city or try dying defending the city.
General Hasnain, you know, while Afghan warlords, the Afghan army are saying that they will fight as hard as they can, in reality, in many of the cities and provinces that have fallen, the armed forces gave up without much of a resistance. If you were to compare just the numeric strength of the Afghan armed forces versus that of the Taliban, it's at least twice more, possibly thrice more. The Americans, the Europeans have armed the Afghan forces well. They've trained many well, especially the commandos. Would you have expected a tougher fight, a stronger pushback? Why is that not happening?
See, Rahul, thank you first of all for having me on your program. This is a very interesting situation which is emerging. I have been observing over the last 20 days. In fact, over the last 10 days in particular, that I did expect that the Afghan National Army, 350,000 strong, including the Afghan National Police with it, would be able to put up a much better resistance, having been trained and equipped to a great extent by the United States, the United Kingdom, to an extent by India. Training has been in India too. But one thing I would like to particularly highlight, this is an established armed force, but it's been trained to fight on conventional terms. And the Taliban, which is, to my estimates, about 70,000 strong, and with the give and take something more from the Pakistani side, what we're expecting that there will be more fighters from the Pakistani side, give them about 100,000. they are fighting a completely different pitch. They are fighting guerrilla, they're fighting militants in the militant manner, and the Afghan National Army is obviously trying to fight the conventional way as taught to them by the British and by the Americans.
No, but that makes no sense, because the Afghan National Army, General Hasnain, was trained to, or at least should have been trained to, fight the Taliban. That was their only enemy. The whole purpose of arming them in the way that they were and training them in the way that they were was to take down the Taliban, and they don't seem to be able to do that.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying, Rahul. They should have been trained to fight guerrilla versus guerrilla, counter guerrilla. But in this case, it seems that they are fighting more conventional. And they're depending on the they've got a small air force with them, about 160 aircraft. They are depending on the American air power to come to their assistance, which has not been coming so often. So as a result of all this, morale seems to be down. Their special forces, which is about 40,000 strong, is supposed to be far better trained, more effective, but they are dispersed in different areas. And they are not being able to come together to fight the proper battles against the cities. The last point here is that there is a rampant corruption which is reported within the ANA. The Afghan commanders, many of the senior commanders, etc., have created, roles on which the non-existent soldiers exist, and a lot of money is changing hands. As you're aware, the Americans are providing most of the underwriting most of the money for this force. So the moment a force of this nature starts wilting, you'll always find this happens anywhere in the world. When it starts wilting, it's very rapid. The deterioration is very rapid. It needs one or two major successes. It needs one or two major successes to get back into the stride again.
I'll come to whether we can turn the situation around in Afghanistan, whether the Afghan armed forces have the ability to do that. Before that, I want to go across to Gautam Mukhopadhyay for his sense of why, and you've seen the warlords who've now been pressed into action, the Afghan National Army itself, the amount of money that they got from the Americans, the British, and including countries like India. Is it because the Taliban carries a so-called religious halo? Is it because the armed forces are demotivated, allegedly corrupt, that they aren't being able to fight? Why aren't we seeing a tougher fight?
Thank you, Rahul. I think first of all, there's an element of surprise. There's an element of denial that the Americans would leave them so much in the lurch. They are actually not facing a foreign force, at least on the face of it. They are facing Afghans who claim to be Afghan patriots also, and also Muslims. So there are various reasons why, in fact, Afghan soldiers are reacting to this like they would to a kind of Afghan rival. But the real test and the real problem is that the US and the NATO have not really built an Afghan national army. All that they have done is built an Afghan special forces counter-terrorist units that are in line with their doctrine of the war, which is that it's a counter-terrorism operation. They were not willing to take a strategic view of Afghanistan and actually invest in a proper Afghan national army with armor, artillery, logistics, mobility, air support, and the rest of it. They were left totally dependent on them for technical support. And finally, they've simply not taken the logic of their knowledge that this war is really operated from Pakistan, which successive American presidents have pointed out, and simply ignored that. And the main reason why they haven't developed this army is out of sensitivities for the Pakistanis. The Pakistanis know that if there is a proper Afghan national army, they are in deep trouble, and they made sure that the West would not equip and create a proper Afghan army. So what we have now is special forces literally running around the whole country. If you have 60,000 Taliban, you probably have the same number of special forces. And they are not trained to defend. They are not trained to hold territory. They are trained to regain targets that have been taken by the terrorists.
I'm going to let Abdul Basit respond to the charge that you and several others across the world, including in the UK and the US, are leveling that this is largely thanks to Pakistan's ISI, that the Afghan Taliban by itself is deeply divided. They have their own ethnic fissures, fights over leadership, and the fact that they're being able to come together in the way that they are is because from behind the scenes they are at this moment still being commandeered by the ISI. How do you respond to that, Mr. Basit?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Thank you very much, Rahul, for having me on your show. I can only express disappointment at those people who put forth such skewed and self-serving arguments and continue impugning Pakistan for all the troubles which they have themselves created in Afghanistan. Pakistan, as a matter of fact, has always tried. Even today, we are trying to promote inter-Afghan reconciliation. It is the US and NATO countries, as well as India. These countries have kind of stoked intra-Afghan chasms. I remember back in 2002 or 2003, Pakistan was a country which even then suggested to US and other countries to bring the Taliban on board the Bonn process. But our proposal was rejected because even then we thought it made no sense for Afghans to keep fighting among each other and spilling bloodshed. So this is what is even happening today. Instead of realizing, doing self-introspection, reflecting on where mistakes were made, it is very convenient to blame and accuse Pakistan. But all these, accusations have become blasé. In Pakistan, we still feel the pain that our neighboring country is, facing the trauma, facing the bloodshed, and we take it's very painful to see Afghanistan in this quagmire. So we hope that all the countries who have created this situation, first, rather than blaming or accusing Pakistan, you look inwards and see as to how this all started. As a matter of fact, Pakistan never asked US to enter into an agreement with the Taliban on the 29th of February last year. You gave legitimacy to the Taliban, and then you decided to withdraw from Afghanistan abruptly without consulting Pakistan or any other country for that matter. And now it is very convenient to blame Pakistan for all the mess you have created in that country.
Let Michael Kugelman respond to that. Abdul Basit making a few important points, and I want you to respond to them one by one. On the one side, you've got the world blaming the ISI for Taliban's resurgence. The fact is that President Biden packed the bags of the American armed forces, pulled most of them out abruptly, arbitrarily, without sealing a proper peace plan with Afghanistan, which was very much up in the air, and yet he pulled out. And now we're seeing the likes of Khalid Noor and others in Afghanistan having to fight for their lives because of what your president did, Michael Kugelman.
Right, and I think that criticism is warranted. We have to go back to the US-Taliban agreement in February 2020, which of course was an agreement that was negotiated without the involvement of Kabul. But the Trump administration, or Donald Trump, wanted to get out, and he essentially was looking for political cover to make it easier to effect a withdrawal. And he got that through an agreement that essentially allowed US troops to leave Afghanistan without getting shot at by the Taliban on the way out. It was a very flawed deal. At the time, I thought it was a worthwhile deal to pursue because it was really the only option at that time for there to be any chance of some type of peace process eventually opening up. And indeed, that agreement was meant to set in motion an intra-Afghan dialogue. Of course, it didn't work out. But in retrospect, indeed, it was a very flawed deal. But that's what we had. And then, President Biden is someone who really doesn't see eye to eye with Donald Trump on much at all. But Afghanistan is something they do see eye to eye on. They have very similar views. And so there was a degree of policy continuity from Trump to Biden in the sense that Biden made a decision to get out as well. And he was very blunt in his decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. He said that we have other priorities elsewhere, which is really, just a heartless thing to say in the context of an Afghan audience, for sure. But, he made very clear that he wanted to focus more on the rivalry with China, on things like climate change, on terrorism threats in other parts of the world that he deemed more serious than those emanating from Afghanistan. And this has been the U.S. policy. And so this is why you've had these horrific optics of the U.S. Hastening its withdrawal from Afghanistan at a moment when the Taliban is waging this unprecedented offensive. But President Biden did not make a decision to leave Afghanistan based on his perception of the strength of the Taliban and the insurgency. He made it based on what he perceived to be a terrorism threat to the United States from Afghanistan that was not strong enough to warrant U.S. forces staying. So I don't think it's likely that the U.S. would stay in Afghanistan and extend this withdrawal deadline. I think that it will be on the way out. These airstrikes that we've seen stepped up by the U.S. to help Afghan security forces, I don't anticipate those will continue after August 31st. I do think that in due course, the U.S. will try to strengthen this so-called over-the-horizon capacity to target al-Qaeda and ISIS, but that doesn't help given the immediate situation on the ground. So I think, bottom line, at the very least, the U.S. has to be in a position to provide assistance, financial assistance to the humanitarian situation, which is we have a monumental humanitarian crisis playing out in Afghanistan right now, and I think that is the immediate need of the hour.
Let's spend a moment talking about what could happen next. The Taliban at this moment are said to be about 80-90 kilometers from the capital, Kabul. Gautam Mukhopadhyay, is the fall of Kabul inevitable? I was reading an American intelligence dispatch report which seemed to suggest that in 30 to 60 days they see the Taliban coming into Kabul and even what's left of resistance elsewhere, according to the Americans, could collapse. Is that your sense as well? What could change? What should be done for the Taliban to be pushed back? Is that at all still possible?
Yeah. Well, nothing is inevitable. As General Atta Hussain said, just a couple of convincing victories could change the morale and could perhaps start reversing the tide. But, we really have to be prepared for the worst. And once the Taliban actually surround most of the key cities and control the highways, quite naturally, the major cities will be besieged. And I think that's the reality that we have to face. We must understand, Afghanistan right now is in a state of shock. Michael, Khalid Noor and others have spoken about the tremendous humanitarian tragedy that is playing out. I think the most immediate point will be dealing with the humanitarian tragedy. But, let's not fool ourselves. Afghans have no place to go. In the last war, they went to Pakistan. This time, both Pakistan will be suspicious and they will not want to go to Pakistan. The world has shut its doors on Afghans. They feel abandoned. They feel betrayed. They feel particularly betrayed by the United States and by President Biden. And, after their state of shock is over, people will regroup and they will have no option but to fight because there is absolutely no support for the Taliban in Afghanistan. And, the Taliban is basically a Pakistani project to erase Afghan and Pashtun nationalism by giving them the opium of an emirate. And it's really just a question of time that, people will fight. This happened in 96 and this will happen again in 2021.
No, but before that, the Taliban are getting access to world quality, high class American military systems, which gives them access to night vision devices, Humvees, which really enhances their fighting capabilities. Khalid Noor, you're not just in Mazar-e-Sharif, not just in northern Afghanistan, but across the country. And especially in Kabul, do you think the Afghan armed forces, the warlords, the people can push back? Is that still possible, or is the fall of Kabul now inevitable?
Well, of course it is still possible to defend Afghanistan. And the Balkh province, Mazar-e-Sharif, has become the center of resistance, the new resistance of the country. We are going to try, and this is our initial plan, to defend the city, and then from Mazar, we will push back the Taliban and retake the north and the cities that has fallen in the hands of the Taliban. Yes, there will be challenges, we do understand that, but there is always a possibility because we have the public support and our people will not surrender to the Taliban. They will not accept a regime by force, an extremist regime. The Taliban have had the same experience before, and they took over all Afghanistan, 95% of the country. But still, they couldn't provide proper service to the people, and the people of Afghanistan opposed them, and that's why they kept losing grounds on a daily basis, and the same thing will repeat itself even if they are to take power by force, which I don't think they will be capable of.
General Hussain, it's in northern Afghanistan that the Taliban faced its most fierce resistance. when they were in power the first time, the warlords of northern Afghanistan pushed the Taliban back very hard. Now it's in North Afghanistan that the Taliban, apart from what's been happening in the south and the west, has been able to make very sharp progress. And part of that is because of the fact that President Ghani spent so much time trying to weaken the warlords who are now being called back into action. Do you think that the Afghan armed forces, these warlords, militias will be able to push the Taliban back, or will Kabul be falling next?
See, Rahul, the issue here is actually a question of the threshold. In any battlefield, there is always the question of the threshold of motivation and morale. You may have the best organization, you may have the best weaponry and ammunition with you, but if you do not have the right motivation and morale, nothing is going to help you. At the moment, I fear that the Afghan National Army, given the string of defeats that they have suffered, is reaching that level of the threshold.
No, but it just, I want to pause you for a moment to ask you this follow-up question. It baffles me because when a lot of these Afghan National Armed Forces are taken prisoner, the fate that awaits them isn't pretty. They could either be killed, they could be locked up, all kinds of barbaric things could happen to them. Given that their own lives are at stake, why then are they not more motivated to fight and push back?
See, Rahul, one is that the 350,000 strong force at the end fights it to the last man, last round, gets captured and then gets butchered. That's a different thing completely. But by and large, when you are reaching such a stage in penny packets, battles being fought all over the country, the emotion, the sentiment to try and get away, escape, perhaps match up with or fetch up with the Taliban, that is very, very tempting. You see, there is nothing really holding back a person at that time. Regimentation, which is what the Indian Army is very famous for, is not something which is such a strong point as far as the ANA is concerned. Therefore, at this time, to put the ANA, the remnants of the ANA now together with the warlords together is going to be a serious challenge. Of course, it can be done. Kabul is not an easy city to just capture like that, I agree. If it has to be fought out in the Syrian manner, there is going to be attrition, there is going.
Abdul Basit, how do you see Taliban's military tactics this time round versus their military tactics when they took charge of Afghanistan the first time round? What is different? Do you think that Kabul will be able to hold out, or will Kabul fall, and is that something Pakistan would like?
I really do not know whether or not Kabul would fall, and if it falls, how long, how much time will the Taliban take? Since I'm not a military man, so it would ill behoove me to comment on these things. But obviously, from Pakistan's perspective, we still believe that this whole conflict needs to be settled politically. I mean, we are really concerned about about the civil war being prolonged and blood of innocent people being spilled. So these are our concerns. Hence, we would very much like the Afghans to sit across the table and work out a sustainable, tenable solution to the problem. As a person, I strongly feel that perhaps the time has come for President Ashraf Ghani to show maturity and step aside. That would really help, in my view, in my personal view, should help the political process to gain momentum. Though at this point in time, when the momentum is in favor of the Taliban may not like to enter into a quid pro quo or give and take, in that process. But I think that if Ashraf Ghani decides to step down, that would open many possibilities to reach out an interim settlement perhaps.
Let's spend a moment talking about what Abdul Basit has just raised. The President Ashraf Ghani is supposed to do an emergency meeting and then a public announcement possibly. There's a lot of talk about the possibility of him stepping aside. If that were to happen, would that then, Michael Kugelman, potentially open the doors for a political settlement? or will it just worsen the current situation and take away whatever semblance of authority and government there still is left in Afghanistan? Because if the Afghans couldn't be negotiated with when they were controlling much lesser of the country, now when they control more than 2/3 of the country, would they really care for Ashraf Ghani if he steps aside?
Yeah, well, certainly the removal of Ashraf Ghani has long been a Taliban demand, and it really has wanted that. And so certainly if he were to step down, that would potentially create an opportunity for there to be some type of negotiation over a new interim government, and even more important, a ceasefire, which of course is needed more than anything else right now. But I really think that unless the Taliban is made to feel more uncomfortable, it's not really going to be willing to negotiate in a responsible way. I mean, we've seen the pattern with the Taliban is that it just keeps demanding more. It gets a lot, it keeps demanding more without giving up much in return. So I think that unless the battlefield situation were to change and the Afghan forces could recover some of the momentum, regain some of the territory they lost, put the Taliban back on the defensive, I can't imagine the Taliban wanting to sit down and negotiate right now. And I hope that I'm wrong, but we need to figure out, or there need to be efforts on the part of Kabul and Washington and others to try to make the Taliban feel uncomfortable. And if that entails, a short-term period of isolation where U.S. officials refuse to meet with the Taliban to try to deny them that legitimacy that they got after signing the deal with the U.S. last year, perhaps that's an option. But I really think that the Taliban needs to feel more uncomfortable before you can expect it
Khalid
to
Noor, do you think if Ashraf Ghani were to step aside, it may open the door for a possible political settlement, or do you think it will make no difference?
Well, looking at the Taliban, I don't see any difference, because we have told them we are willing to form a transitional government together with the Taliban, a government that will be inclusive of all Afghans, and everyone will see themselves, all ethnicities of the country. But it is the Taliban who are not very interested to a political settlement and to a joint government. So looking at their actions in the last, let's say, 10, 11 months, I think it's very difficult for me to say that the Taliban will do anything good if President Ghani steps aside. But we will have to see how things will fold up. If they're serious, everything is there's always options to negotiate. And
General Hassan, purely from a military perspective, I wonder if Ashraf Ghani stepping aside would make any difference to the Taliban, because when they were in charge of a much smaller part of Afghanistan, if at that time there'd been a settlement, Ashraf Ghani had stepped down, it may have made some difference. Now when they think they have the momentum, they think they're on the doors of Kabul, would the president stepping aside make any difference to their military plans?
I agree with you entirely, Rahul. The Taliban is on the go. They've got the momentum going at the moment, and why should they compromise on that? And since my connection got broken, let me just add also that this is the stage, if you want to make a difference from the ANA side, from the Government of National Unity side, this is the time where the Americans should actually be seen to be coming to their assistance.
What should they do? They're sending a few soldiers. They're sending a few hundred soldiers, but that's largely to help evict the remaining Americans who are at the embassy. What should they do? I don't mean that, Rahul, at all. Those 3,000 are coming for evacuation of the American embassy, etc. I'm looking at airstrikes. Primarily, a plethora of airstrikes coming in at this time. One key battle, maybe Mazar-e-Sharif, maybe any other place where the tide can be turned back. Once that happens, demonstrated on the ground, things can change many times. But the Americans seem to be very tardy about this. They can move their fleet into the northern Indian Ocean and possibly from there look at air resources in a bigger way, because it is air power which can make a huge difference here. Unfortunately, the Americans don't seem to be. Michael Kugelman, what's the thinking in Washington, D.C. and in the Pentagon and State Department at this moment? Would Washington and Biden's administration be willing to back with sustained, continuing airstrikes even after the last of American soldiers move away, or are they just going to stop and turn the tap shut?
I think there's a lot of debate going on about that. As I had said earlier, I think it's unlikely. I imagine that those airstrikes will stop after August 31st. But I think that there is a debate going on, and as I understand it, it's President Biden himself who has been the most resistant to continuing those U.S. military activities against the Taliban. So it remains to be seen. But certainly, the more if the current trends continue, if the Taliban continues its march, and as it gets closer to Kabul, I think that you're going to have many more powerful voices in Washington, including within the administration, that may well try to convince Biden to change his mind. But at the end of the day, does that really do anything in the end? I mean, if you continue those airstrikes, the U.S. is not going to continue those airstrikes for months and years ahead. It would only be for a modest period of time. And once it stops, unfortunately, you'd have to fear that the Taliban could, regain any momentum it's lost and continue its assault. So I think that airstrikes are really not a sustainable solution. And of course, there's also a huge risk of civilian casualties, which is already such a big concern right now.
And the one fear from an Indian perspective in the midst of all of this is about people of Indian origin who are in Afghanistan, the Hindus and the Sikhs, as also the assets that India built across all the provinces of Afghanistan, 400 plus assets. What happened now was, after the fall of Herat, the Taliban claimed to have captured the India-Afghanistan Friendship Dam, which was inaugurated by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2016. It's not just Indian assets that are in jeopardy. Pakistan-backed Taliban could also prove to be a serious security nightmare, because once these Afghan militias, once these Taliban fighters are done with their job in Afghanistan, the nightmare situation for India is that they could be diverted by the ISI to Jammu and Kashmir.
India has joined Germany, Qatar and Turkey in calling for an immediate
Now you've got a situation where a dam that India built painstakingly being taken over by the by the Taliban. What India is saying officially is that, the helicopter that's been taken is now an Afghan asset. But that's really just a manner of speaking. The fact is that this is India's hard-earned money that now is in the control of the Taliban. Gautam Mukhopadhyay, given what the Taliban have done so far, and given the interests the Taliban should have with the fact that these dams are producing hydroelectricity and therefore it is to the advantage of the people of Afghanistan, are these assets safe? Because we're also dealing with the Taliban and they're crazy.
Yeah. So, there are two issues here. One is there's no doubt that, these were things that we did for the Afghans and handed it over to them. They were for the Afghan people, and if they harm these projects, frankly, they're going to be harming something for the Afghan people. Second, the Taliban have always sort of labored the point that, they are not against Indian projects. So I don't see why they should do it. But one can't rule out a third country, interest in trying to damage the project just to spite us. But on the whole, I would say that, we have made these investments, but we don't look at them as purely physical investments. They are investments made in the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. And they have had that effect. And so I don't think the Taliban would be so short-sighted as to, betray that they are completely Pakistan's proxies.
No, but you've also raised the concern about the ISI and Islamabad, and I want to go across once again to Abdul Basit on this, because, for example, the parliament building was made by India at a cost of $90 million, opened in 2015 by Prime Minister Modi. A block in the building is named after former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Now, in the calculation of people like Gautam Mukhopadhyay and General Hasnain, the ISI would like the Taliban to blow that up, which would really, sensibly speaking, be very short-sighted, because a lot of the projects like the Zaranj-Delaram Highway, the Salma Dam, health infrastructure, transportation, this is all to the benefit of the people of Afghanistan. But the ISI, of course, won't see it like that.
I find your fixation with the ISI amusing, Rahul. Why would, even Taliban would never like to go down that route and dismantle or destroy such projects which are for the people of Afghanistan. So I really can't. I find it very difficult to even put up an argument on this count, because why ISI, Taliban, why Pakistan would have any interest in worsening the situation in Afghanistan? As I have been saying, and I have said earlier as well, it is in Pakistan's interest to have peace in Afghanistan. We want to have a stable Afghanistan, whereas some other countries, even India, you have never allowed peace in Afghanistan, to come. You have stoked intra-Afghan divergences, and you have driven wedges among Afghans, whereas Pakistan's policy has always been very, very clear. Now we did perhaps make some mistakes in the past, but we have learned from our past mistakes. So we would not like to repeat those mistakes. Now, everybody in Pakistan agrees that we want peace in Afghanistan, peace is in our interest, and we are working towards it.
Okay, you made some charges about India's role. I'm out of time, but I'm going to give Gautam Mukhopadhyay a very quick opportunity to rebut what we just heard from Abdul Basit. Mr. Mukhopadhyay.
The Pakistanis are very good in playing this kind of pious talk, crocodile tears, double speak, and playing victim, sounding very good and so on. On the question of what Afghans think of us and whether we are playing a divisive role, I think I would actually let the Afghans answer, and the answer is resounding. The answer is also visible in the viral trending Sanction Pakistan hashtag that is currently in Afghanistan, which has picked up perhaps 800,000 or more, supporting supports. So, look, Pakistan is viewed as the enemy. This is Pakistan's war. This is a Pakistani, effectively an invasion in the guise of Afghans. This is a Pakistani project right from 1992. They have waited. They have done their U-turns. They have been clever about it. But, there will be blowback. And there will be blowback. Unfortunately, the blowback will be felt not just by India, also by Pakistan, by the region as a whole, and actually eventually the whole world, because the Taliban, while they may claim to be sort of interested only in Afghanistan, their tapestry is completely mixed up with all kinds of transnationalist terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And both the Russians and the Americans will realize this sooner or later.
Well, we've had a very high-quality discussion. We've heard different points of view being articulated from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from the United States, Indian civilian and military voices. This is a story we'll keep tracking. India Today was the first network to have boots on the ground in Afghanistan. We've got more reporters on our way to Afghanistan. We will keep tracking this very tragic story as it unfolds over the days and weeks to come. But I just hope that the armed forces are able to regroup, push back, because what you don't want is Afghanistan falling into the hands of the Taliban. There must be a strong military pushback. For the time being, Khalid Noor, Gautam Mukhopadhyay, General Atta Hasnain, Abdul Basit and Michael Kugelman for lighting up the news track with your insights. Thank you very much. We may not agree on much, but especially with Abdul Basit, but I appreciate him taking out time to join us to give us a Pakistani perspective on the situation in Afghanistan. We're slipping into a break. I'll have more for you on the other side. Stay with us. We're back in a moment.